Hi, Aurora. This is Ira, and I'm recording here my audio feedback on your statement of belief. And I want to be clear as I'm doing so. This is not really assessment feedback or evaluation feedback of the statement of belief itself, but rather responses to that statement that I hope will be helpful in these final hours as you're completing revision over the next couple of days of your major essay for the course, the Defining Good Argument in Digital Contexts essay. So please take my comments as really formative rather than summative or evaluative. That said, I enjoyed reading this, and I'm looking forward to reading your more fully or richly theorized perspective in that major essay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read again back through here, and as I'm doing so, I'm going to highlight and note some spots that I think are particularly strong or that I want to challenge you on, or where I think you may need to develop the argument more fully. I want to just sort of start by acknowledging, like, there's a lot of really, I would say, basically the whole first page, and mostly the whole first page is sort of given over to saying that good argument today is virtually impossible. It's very difficult, very hard to find, and that historically argument was different, it was better. And actually, I have both good news and bad news about that. The bad news is, historically, a lot of our argument has not been good in the ways that you subsequently define. In other words, I would say that, for instance, instead of allowing ourselves to be put in a vulnerable position and actively listen to the other side's opinions, we are confident that our opponent's core beliefs are wrong. And one of the things that's nice about a historical view on rhetoric and argumentation is that exactly that, which I agree makes argument very difficult, but exactly that has been present innumerable times throughout human history, including very much at the time that rhetoric and the formal study of argument first emerged as a scholarly discipline in classical Greece. So the bad news is the difficulties and problems of argument are not new. They're deep parts of human history. The good news is the same things that you argue for as good argument in this essay have also kind of turned up time and again throughout our troubled history. So I just kind of want to, really just in general, kind of reading this first page, just a little cautionary note. I would stay away from just from the fall from grace narrative a little bit. I don't know that we've ever had great argument, or that we've ever been great at getting along in words. Because if we were, the history of the species would be much, much less violent and messy. On the other hand, I do think that there's more possibility, and you trace that out in the rest of this statement of belief, but there's more possibility than this first page would give rise to. And so in thinking about that, when you say the best argument we're able to give in modern times is the avoidance of argument itself, I'm torn. On the one hand, that's a stark, powerful statement that would be very, very interesting to see you defend fully, and also, almost by definition, would be very difficult to defend fully, since doing so would require an argument. But still, it would be interesting to see you navigate and grapple with that contradiction and difficulty. On the other hand, I have to say I think that there's more hope for our times, difficult and troubled as they are, precisely because things have always been difficult and troubled. And it doesn't mean that our current forms of difficulty are the same as older forms. Of course, they're not, and I think there's some important features of the digital world that change that, as you know. But don't get too caught up in that ultimately kind of hopeless stance would be my suggestion. Or if you're going to, make the case fully. Because right now what's happening is you sort of start to make that case, but only kind of sort of, and then sort of drop it. So I would say either go one way or the other. Either make a case for good argument out of a stance of just a glimmer of hope and the possibility of more of that, which is what the rest of the statement of belief does, or make an argument for not arguing at all, and try to show how you would do that, in part by negotiating the contradiction that arises when a person makes an argument for not arguing. Okay, so just moving forward, I think this sort of core sense is that a good argument is where parties, and I'm going to encourage you to stay away from both, right? Because there can be lots of parties to an argument, but where the parties are able to put aside their beliefs and pride for a short while and begin to understand their opponent's or opposer's point of view. So the way that you're defining good argument is by presenting it as being about really an approach, an attitude, and an attitude that allows for the understanding of others. And I think probably obviously that's a viewpoint I'm very sympathetic to. And you say to actively listen with love and kindness is to attempt to come to some form of agreement. And I think that is, again, something I value and sort of share the sensibility, and at the same time I kind of want to challenge you on those things, not because, as you say, it's hardly ever achievable. I don't know, maybe it's not very often achievable. I wouldn't be surprised if we achieve it quite a bit more often than you're thinking, but I want to challenge you on this for a different reason, and that's because it seems to me like a conversation where we put aside our beliefs and pride and simply seek to understand one another. And that is the pure, unfiltered thing that we're doing. It seems to me that might not be an argument at all. That just sounds like a nice conversation. So I wonder if the definition here itself might not really be entirely a definition of argument. Where's the argument? It seems like this, set aside our beliefs and pride and begin to understand one another, is a wonderful thing to do, but again, is more of like a friendly conversation than even a friendly argument, which seems like, I think you're saying we need to do these things, and I agree with that. I don't actually disagree. I have no problem with that, etc. But it seems like doing these things can't be quite the definition of argument, of good argument in its pure and unfiltered sense, because if it were the definition, then argument would have no real opposing. But it does seem like argument has some kind of opposing. There's an attempt to come to some form of agreement, as you put it here, relative to our real oppositions. So I think at the level of the theory, at the level of the abstract question of goodness in argument, this is one of the things to kind of work out a little more fully in your Defining Good Argument in Digital Contexts essay. What actually is argument for? What happens in argument? Even argument that goes well seems to me like there must be some kind of opposing. And if there is, how does that reshape the way that you think about good argument? And if there's not, what is this thing that we call argument that it doesn't necessarily have opposition in it? So those are some kind of like bigger picture questions. At the level of thinking about of bad argument, which is you say here, verbally attacking all opposing views, is a bad form of argument, must be avoided, in an attempt to find good arguments. Fair enough. But what about the middle ground? What about the ground where one is not attacking all views, but is attacking some? Is that bad? If so, why? If not, why not? And also, what about argument where the people arguing are only sort of trying to persuade or come to agreement with one another, and they're partly performing an argument for some other parties? Is that necessarily bad? Why? Can that sometimes be good? What does it look like? Or what would that look like if it were going to be good to perform an argument? I'd stay away from like the originally stuff. I just don't, you don't do yourself, and again, this is not a problem for the statement of belief, to be clear, but just so you know, in the Defining Good Argument in Digital Context essay, the kind of originally things were thus in such a way, and now they have fallen, is rarely historically accurate. Just as a general rhetorical gambit, it's rarely historically accurate. Typically, things were originally, somewhat like they are now and somewhat different. So I'd stay away from that kind of way of telling the story. But this notion that argument is to possibly shape or alter another's viewpoint, that seems like it's kind of at odds with this idea of setting aside beliefs and pride in order to understand one another. So I'd be interested to hear more about how you negotiate the tension between those things, because I think that's a really important tension. Now, when you think about having arguments filled with compassion and understanding, I encourage you to think like, okay, fine. Let me just grant your premise. Let's just suppose that most arguments aren't like that. I'm not actually sure that that's like empirically correct. I think we have just so many arguments. So much of our lives are arguments that actually quite a lot of them have compassion and understanding. But regardless, let me just suppose for the sake of argument, that this statement is correct, that it can be hard to find a willing participant for an argument filled with compassion and understanding. Let's suppose that that's correct. Fair enough. Cool. How do you make an argument that seeks such a participant? What does that look like? If a good argument is one that seeks arguers who are filled with compassion and understanding, what does that tell us about how good arguments should look, how they should be made, especially in digital contexts? And this is where you start to get into like literally, concretely what you think that should look like. Offering facts shrouded in examples of other points of view that correlate with your own. And so I think that's a really interesting articulation. I might change the word shrouded, but offering facts set together with or whatever, examples of other points of view that correlate with my own. I'd love to see you unpack that more. Say more about what is that? What does that mean? How does that work? What's at stake there? What's the goal? Why would that be persuasive? What's the mechanism of action? If that's the thing that you're doing to try to persuade the other party, what's the mechanism of action that makes that persuasive? And if persuading and being persuaded is the point, how does that reshape the way you were talking before about understanding? Because those seem like they're not necessarily the same. I think it's important and valuable that you talk here about the fact that there are forms of argument that are effective that you, in fact, wouldn't really like very much. And that you kind of start to look into what it would mean to make effective arguments that are accepting our self-centeredness. Cool. I think that's actually really interesting as well. And I'd love to hear you say more about that. Can those effective arguments be good? If so, how? And how does that reshape your definition? And if not, why not? So I kind of in closing want to just sort of encourage you to take the different pieces that make this up, or the pieces that make up however much of this you've carried forward into your major essay, and really kind of dive down with each of the pieces. Help us understand more. What is this? What does it mean to use compassion? What does it mean to use logic? What does it mean to use active listening? But then also, why do those things work the way that you say they work? And also, what about the cases where they don't? What do we do with those? Let's say we can't exactly opt out of them. We live together in the world. So is there still some possibility of good argument when these are constrained in some way? And if so, what is that? And if not, what do we do about that? So again, I enjoyed reading this, and I'm really looking forward to seeing your major essay soon. And happy writing. Thanks. Bye.